And Susan, the webinar is live now, and you can start whenever you are ready.
Great, thank you so much. All right, so first I wanted to go ahead and introduce myself and thank everyone who is listening either on this live stream or on a recording that we will post on the website tomorrow. Additionally, tomorrow we will have a second rundown of this webinar that will start in the morning. And with no further ado, my name is Susan Elliott, and I am the Climate Protection Program Manager for the City of Charlottesville. We are having this workshop as our first community workshop in developing a climate action plan for the City of Charlottesville. Let me make sure I got my slides. There we go. They have structured this into 4 30-minute segments. Each segment will have its own question and answer period. And our hope is that because we are doing this in a virtual format, putting the schedule out there of when we'll be talking about each topic will enable community members to be able to join us when it is convenient for them. But additionally, if anybody is then watching the recording, they will be able to have a clear time stamp to jump ahead to be able to zero in on the parts that are of most interest for them. We're going to start today with going over an introduction and overview of the Climate Action Plan development process, talking about Charlottesville's emissions profile, and then some very high-level example climate action strategies. Then at 30 minutes in, we will transition over to talking about stationary sources of emissions. As you'll see, this is generally our buildings' energy use and primarily is coming out of the residential and commercial activities within the city. Then at the hour point, we will shift to speaking about renewable energy. And then at the hour-and-a-half point, we'll do transportation and then wrap up within 2 hours. In terms of keeping up to date of what's happening with this process, we do have a webpage set up on the city's website. That webpage is at charlottesville.gov/climateplan. That is where you can find information about workshop recordings, other informational materials, and then also information about future events. There is also a link to a contact form where you can reach out to us if you have some direct comments that you would like to provide separately from any of the other input opportunities we're providing as part of this process. Additionally, if you want to receive any sort of push notifications, either from email or texted to your phone, you can sign up for the climate action topic within the city's news flashes. To sign up on that, you can go to charlottesville.gov/list.aspx, and then you'll have to enter in your contact information, scroll down the page, and you'll be able to then find where it says climate action, and you can go ahead and subscribe there. So starting off with our slideshow for today, we're talking about first our climate plan development process. As background of what has brought us to this point, in 2017, the city committed to the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy Commitment. This is not the first commitment the city of Charlottesville made. The first one was actually the U.S. Mayor's Agreement on Climate back in 2006, which is then what spurred the city to create the Climate Protection Program in 2007. Over the years, there have been a variety of different initiatives that the city's Climate Protection Program has worked on. Where we are right now, following the Global Covenant of Mayors commitment, is we are developing a climate action plan to meet the greenhouse gas reduction goals that Council adopted in 2019. Those goals are a 45% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, and then achieving carbon neutrality by 2050. In addition to focusing on our emissions reductions, there is also the Global Covenant of Mayors commitment, an intention to develop a climate adaptation plan. We had originally planned on starting these pieces earlier in 2020, but due to COVID, our timeline was delayed. And so now these pieces will be overlapping slightly, but still being developed in somewhat of a sequential pattern. In addition to what the Global Covenant of Mayors commitment gives us in terms of guidance and requirements for what the climate action plan needs to address, we also had direction from City Council in a 2019 resolution. Some key items that this directs for the plan to do is to look at front-loading our reductions, to identify sub-goals for our different sectors and strategies, to address equity specifically throughout the plan, to include measurement frequency and accountability mechanisms, to address funding and financing options that enable and support private sector action, to address the feasibility of integrating zero-emission vehicles both in the community and within the municipal fleet, and to work in conjunction with our regional partners so that we can implement seamless programs and services. And really, the short version of that is just make it easy on our community that they can go throughout our region, hear the same messages, and know they have the same services and levels of options available to them. To develop our climate action plan, we're going to frame this in borrowing out of a strategic plan framework. We've selected this because it is action focused. It keeps our goals front and center so we can look at making sure we achieve our 2030 reduction goal and also have an eye on what we need to achieve by 2050. Strategic plans also have iterative updates, recognizing that there are going to be future changes, both in terms of what we succeed on, but also in terms of what options are out there, whether it is in the funding or technology landscape. By working with a strategic plan framework, we can focus on actions in the near term, getting started on the things that really set us up well to achieve our long-term goals, and naturally have a process to incorporate updates as we go. One of the other pieces, I had mentioned that the city began its climate protection program back in 2007. We also heard from the community that they don't want us to waste time by reinventing the wheel. They want us to build on what we've done. They want us to build on what our peer localities have done. And they want us to work regionally so that we are building on existing systems for funding, for development, and for cooperation as we look at how we go towards achieving our climate action goals. To inform what this climate action plan is in terms of engaging the community, in part because we are on a shortened timeline, we are taking the approach of a layered community engagement tiers of opportunities for input. So for community members, there are opportunities such as this workshop. There'll be online questionnaires or surveys and opportunities to review drafts and provide comment about what should be in the climate action plan and priorities and values of our community. We'll also be working with some specific stakeholders in topic expertise and through small group facilitated discussions. We'll be forming core topic teams, which are comprised of city staff, our institutional partners, and representatives of the community who serve on city committees, boards, and advisory boards and commissions. We will have a plan liaison committee, which will be executives and program leads from within the city and its regional planning partners. And then in regards to bringing equity and a diverse variety of perspectives into the plan, we are going to have some direct outreach to certain stakeholder groups. We're going to be holding an equity workshop in January. And out of that, we hope that we will have volunteers to join us in forming a work group that will be able to do that deeper dive in terms of the climate action strategies and proposed actions, and make sure that we are considering equity implications, but also looking at how we can design our implementation aspects to best serve and make this plan equitable. In addition to these more formal layers of community engagement, we are also looking at building on other efforts that are happening in our community. Some examples of those are climate justice mapping being led by the UVA Equity Center, the housing strategy development and the comprehensive plan update that is being led by other departments within the city, a landfill diversion study looking at how we can divert waste from our landfill and improve our services that the city is offering to its residents and businesses, and also a training on how to start bringing in forestry and land use assessments into our greenhouse gas profile. When we look at where our emissions are coming from, we can see that largely they are coming from three main portions of our community: our residential, our commercial uses, and our transportation. Because of this, we are doing a sequence of how we are approaching the topics. So for today, you may have noticed that we are focusing on our buildings, our renewable energy sources, and our transportation. Over the course of our community engagement, we will also be bringing in other topics such as waste, sequestration drawdown, energy sourcing beyond just renewables landscaping, that bring in the natural landscape that we have, as well as equity, and looking throughout at what does this mean in terms of opportunities that we have to help fund and bring financing resources to the community so that they can take action. Moving on to talk about Charlottesville's greenhouse gas emissions and really where are we starting at this point. I thought it would be useful to share with you a simple understanding or a snapshot really of how our greenhouse gas emissions are calculated. Greenhouse gas emissions are calculated for our community profile according to protocols that have been established and are used by communities around the globe. The simple formula that lays behind all of those different pieces is you have your activity data, which you multiply by your carbon intensity, and that produces the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that your community is putting up into the air. The type of data that this includes is what your electricity use is, the amount of vehicle miles traveled, the amount of tons of waste that you are sending into the landfill rather than diverting to a different method of being managed. The carbon intensity is what the amount of carbon dioxide equivalents there are that is per unit of whatever that activity data is. And that combined total is then what we are putting up into the air as a community. Looking back at past inventories, we're looking at 2000 to 2011 and 2016. What we saw is that there is an increasing rate of reductions in emissions that we've seen as a community. And as of 2016, we're about halfway to our 2030 goal. When we dig deeper into the 2016 profile, and this is similar I showed you before, we have those three main sectors, our community transportation, our residential, and our commercial. And out of that, you can see pretty clearly that these three make up the vast majority of where our emissions are coming from as a community. In addition to that, just the electricity and natural gas usage within our residential and commercial properties is equal to more than 50% of what our profile is. So if we're going to be looking at where can we reduce emissions, these three sectors and their different fuel sources that are being used to power our buildings, to move us around town, are really where we have the most opportunity. So going back over to looking at what this equation is, what we have is on the left side, that's what's being put up into our air. What we have on the right side is then if we want to reduce emissions, we're actually having to pull those emissions out of the air. So the type of actions that address these three different pieces of the equation, there is reducing induced demand. For example, what is there that you can take away the absence for needing to use that activity or needing to use that amount of energy or fuel source. You can look at increasing the efficiency of what equipment you're using so that you aren't using as much fuel or energy to accomplish the same goal. And then there's things like conservation behaviors where it's making choices about what we're doing on a moment-to-moment basis. In terms of carbon intensity, there are two primary ways that this is looked at. One is looking at lowering the carbon fuels, switching fuels to something that's a lower carbon intensity. The other is trying to go to something that is carbon-free. Both of these strategies work together, and in a lot of conversations about how to achieve carbon neutrality, it's actually a sequence where first you want to switch to using a fuel source that is lower carbon, and then, for example, electricity, and then you start to change what is powering that electricity to make it carbon-free. Once you have the emissions up in the air, the options for reducing emissions are sequestration. So, for example, trees and vegetation. I guess it was in maybe elementary school where we started learning that how plants breathe is that they breathe in carbon dioxide and they push out oxygen. There's also strategies that are intentional large-scale carbon farming and carbon capture and also sequestration. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pause and ask if we have any questions in terms of anything around this process, opportunities for engagement, and around greenhouse gas emissions and how they are calculated. And I'm going to hand this over to Lasheen Parks from the city's communications office, who will go ahead and moderate that and bring people in for questions.
Hi everyone, my name is Lasheen Parks and I am the city's social media and marketing coordinator. I'm going to be moderating the Q&A question portion of this meeting. So if you do have a question or a comment at this time, if you will go ahead and raise your hand, and I will bring you into the webinar so you can ask your question. So we have one person raising their hand. So Peter, I am going to bring you in, and you might have to unmute yourself, and you are able to speak.
Hi there. Good afternoon. Thanks for taking my question. My question is how you define community transport. Is that transportation that residents and government and local businesses are doing, or is that transportation that's happening within city territory? Thank you.
Sure. So the way that the community transportation is calculated is it is based on vehicle mile counts within the city of Charlottesville jurisdiction. So that is residents, businesses, including public vehicles as well that are being counted.
Thank you. So it's travel within the territory of Charlottesville.
Yes, so anything that's within our jurisdictional bounds. What would also get counted in that is if UVA, University Transit System bus is driving through the city limits, that potentially could be caught up in the data that we receive. Similar to vehicles from Albemarle County staff that are traveling in between, anybody who are visitors to our area for tourism, or anyone connected with even like the federal or the state that are coming in and out. So one thing to note with the community transportation sector is that the data that we have available is based on vehicle mile counts. So it doesn't tell us how many people are in any of those vehicles. It does not tell us the difference between if it's counting a CAT transit bus, a jaunt transit bus, or a UTS one, or a school bus. It does not tell us if it is a Greyhound bus or if it is for example, someone is biking or walking around. It's not, well, biking and walking don't have the carbon factors associated with it, but we also don't have counts for those. So it's really based on like what are the vehicles and then estimates in terms of the fuel usage that those vehicles would be using.
If anyone else would like to ask a question, you can go ahead and raise your hand. And if you are calling by phone, if you press *9, you can raise your hand that way. Susan, it doesn't look like any. Oh, wait, here's one. Okay, so I'm going to bring in Martha. She has a question.
Hi, I'm Martha Smythe, and I was wondering if you look at the age of some of these vehicles, as well as, whether it's a bus or a truck or a family car. I notice a lot of construction vehicles around the area that are puffing out black, stinky smoke, and it just seems like that's a little different from somebody that's got an up-to-date or economical vehicle.
Yeah, so that's a really good point. The type of data that we have access to, it doesn't differentiate for us what the age of the vehicles are. So we have to use approximations. What we get, and I'll talk about this a little bit later when we get to the transportation section. So you may hear it again, but I have parents who are both public ed teachers, so that never hurts to hear something more than once. With that, in terms of the vehicle counts that we get, it is the vehicle miles traveled and then the percentage breakdown of what vehicle types. So for example, was it a motorcycle? Was it a passenger sedan type vehicle? Was it a large truck with multiple axles? To then figure out what that would mean in terms of emissions, we are having to use broader industry standards and national data about what the average miles per gallon or fuel efficiency is for those vehicles. It is one area that there potentially we could work regionally to try to pull some local data sets together to try to get a better approximation so that we're not relying on national data. But that is one of the challenges when you're trying to pull community-wide data together, is we often don't have that level of granularity that really allows us to point out through the data what those differences are. I do want to make a distinction, though, that just because we can't necessarily pull it out of the data, that doesn't mean that logically we can't look at what the scenarios and that older cars are and vehicles are typically less fuel efficient, and then design strategies and actions to try to address those emission uses.
The next person we have is Susan Cruz. So I'm going to bring Susan in. Susan, you are able to ask your question.
Hi. So my question, I guess I have two questions. One about transportation. It's my understanding that we're also part owners of the airport, and so as the city is sort of has that in its jurisdiction, are airplane and airline emissions included in the community transport? That's one question. And the other question I have is, in the improvement that we've seen between the prior inventory and this one, were you able to make any determination of that? You know, we're halfway to our goal. How much of that is by actions that we have taken as a community? And how much is that just sort of like because the grid is getting cleaner or cars are getting more efficient and is really not attributable to actions we have taken as a community? So two questions there.
Yeah, great, thank you. Both of those are good questions. So in terms of the airport, the way the protocols are structured is you as an organization need to define what your boundary is. And depending on whether you're a private sector commercial one, or if you're reporting under the community protocols, what your boundary definitions are may vary. For the community protocols, it is whether the emissions are produced within our jurisdictional boundary. So while we do contribute to regionally economically to what's happening at the airport, the location of the airport being outside of the city's boundary means that we do not have the emissions from the airport as part of the transportation within the city's boundary. Another comparable to that is looking at the train lines. And for the 2016 inventory, we were not able to get data for Amtrak or CSX to be able to include that, but that is one of the things that we've noted for future inventory updates to try to add in, is to figure out what sort of emissions we can count for those rail lines that in the portion of the passenger trip and commercial trips that are happening in the city, so that within the city's jurisdiction, that we can include it in our community profile. Also, one thing that I did not say before, but if you want to dive in more on the greenhouse gas emission reports and past ones that the city has done, those are all available online at charlottesville.gov/emissions. And we are also working to be able to publish an interactive dashboard, a data dashboard, that will then hopefully make it easier for community members to dig in and see what type of data is within our emissions profiles. But also, as we add new inventory years, it'll automatically update in the profile so that there isn't a lag time between getting data and then having to do a static PDF report.
Susan, do you know if the county counts the airport emission or is counting the airport emissions in their current inventory?
I do not know about the past inventories, but it would be based on whatever protocols they're using for future inventory calculations that they're doing. I would presume that it would be part of what their profile is. And considering the regional nature of it, I would also find it to be perfectly reasonable if they include it in the profile, but they then kind of do a call out box or something that speaks to what proportion within their transportation sector really is the airport versus is more local everyday activity that most people are doing.
And did you have thoughts on how much of that halfway to our goal is based on actions we've taken versus general improvements in the grid?
Yes, thank you for the reminder. I got caught up in transportation and forgot you had your second question. I don't remember off the top of my head how much is from the grid versus local action, but we did see reductions that could be attributed in both directions to that. The big difference that happened on the grid, which I think you're aware of, but for anyone else who's listening, is that during that time period, Dominion Power started switching the fuel sources it's using to generate the electricity. The city of Charlottesville's electricity is all within the Dominion territory, so that is the only electric utility that the city of Charlottesville residents and businesses work with. And they had started transitioning from using more of their coal-powered plants into using the natural gas-fired ones. And so in terms of looking at bigger strategies, definitely what the utilities are doing does have a big impact in terms of our local emissions, because it speaks directly to what that carbon intensity is that we are then operating the rest of our pieces with. Some of the other things that we saw on the transportation side was we did see the vehicle fuel efficiencies changing. So the amount of vehicle miles traveled per amount of emissions for that, we saw a reduction on that front, which to us, we saw that as a reflection of overall, across all vehicle types, fuel efficiency improvements happening.
Okay, if anyone else has, oops, Sina, let me bring you in. Okay, Sina, you should be on.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, Susan. I was curious, and this is kind of a side question. When someone goes solar in the city, does that then get attributed to the cleaner energy of the whole grid, or does that get attributed to Charlottesville reducing its carbon?
Yes, that's a really good question. So it goes back to how the property is metered. For the most part, if somebody has installed solar on their property and then they are net metered, that counts as a reduction of emissions within the Charlottesville community. When we get the data from Dominion in terms of the total amount of electricity purchased, any of the electricity that was generated and then worked out in that net meter equation as being used on site, those are not counted as kilowatt hours that came from the grid. And so we don't then apply any sort of a carbon factor to those kilowatt hours that were generated on site. The one exception I would say to that is Dominion did start a program where it would lease the rooftops from people. And that was structured in such a way that there would actually be an entirely second meter added to the building. And whoever was generating the electricity on the rooftop actually sold all of that to Dominion. And they then included that electricity generation as part of its overall grid profile. What I recollect from that program was that to be an eligible property, you had to have a pretty substantial size of a rooftop footprint for that. And so given Charlottesville's building profile, I don't believe we had very many, or actually, I don't know from Dominion if we had any within our jurisdiction. But I would be surprised if we had a substantial number that we would then be seeing a lot of solar on buildings in Charlottesville that would not actually be reducing Charlottesville's carbon footprint.
All right, if anyone else wanted to come on and ask a question, make sure you raise your hand now, but there are going to be other opportunities throughout this presentation to ask questions. But just for right now, if you do have a question, raise your hand and I can bring you in. Susan, it doesn't look like anyone has raised their hand, so we can continue the presentation.
All right, great, thank you so much. I will go ahead and stop my video and advance over to the next slide, which it looks like we are actually just on time. anyone who's seen me do presentations before, you know, I can sometimes speed talk my way through things. So I'm very happy that we're right at that 30-minute point when we were planning to transition over to speaking specifically about the stationary sources of emissions within the city. As a reminder, just because we did advertise the time points, if we have anybody new who has joined us or who has skipped ahead to this point in the slide deck on the recording, we are going to be posting the recording, other informational materials, information on future events on our the website, charlottesville.gov/climateplan. There's also a contact form there, and you have the ability to sign up to get push notifications that anytime we are posting something new, we will send out an alert through the Newsflash system, and you can keep up to date that way to make sure that you don't miss out on anything. Right, so stationary emission sources. This term usually provides or creates some sort of confusion for people. Stationary sources are activities that produce greenhouse gas emissions that are connected to a single location. So something that is not mobily moving around the city. This would be things such as buildings and streetlights. The sectors that we see in our greenhouse gas emission profile that are stationary sources are our residential, commercial, municipal government, non-municipal government, and industry sectors. When we look at our 2016 profile specifically, you can see those three sectors. This is the same pie chart as I showed before. The residential and commercial are both stationary sources. The community transport is considered a mobile source. I put next to each of those sectors what the percent of contribution is to that 2016 profile. Obviously, residential and commercial are equal more than 50% of it. Our municipal government, so all of the municipal government and city school buildings, as well as all of the trail lighting and street lighting in the city, accounts for just under 3% of the overall pie chart that you see there on the right. Additionally, non-municipal government and then industry is extremely small within the city as a whole. Thinking back to how we are, that calculation for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, when we talk about reducing them for stationary sources, we're really looking at the green part on the left on how do we affect that activity data, and then how do we affect that carbon intensity for what fuel sources those stationary uses and those stationary activities are drawing from. One of the ways to try to get our kind of mental arms around this idea of what is the scale and breadth of action that is needed to either reduce the greenhouse, reduce induced demand. What I mean by that in this context would be, how do we reduce the amount of energy that is needed to be used? If you think about your home, if you think about whether you have good insulation and air sealing, your home is able to then retain its comfort for a longer period of time without needing to use your heating and cooling system to generate what that comfortable level of temperature. When we're looking at increasing equipment efficiency, examples of this could be, it focuses on how do you reduce the amount of energy that the equipment needs to perform that same task. So one example could be looking at an HVAC system, a heat pump, versus doing baseboard heating. It can be looking at, if you are looking at two different options for an HVAC system, what is the energy efficiency rating for that, or for your hot water heater? Even as something like your light bulbs, LED light bulbs use significantly less amount of energy than incandescents or CFLs to produce the same effect of providing that light for you. When we get over to things like conservation behaviors, what we're looking at in that space is making the choice, for example, to turn off items that are not in use, or to use devices such as programmable thermostats so that it is adjusting automatically based on a schedule that you program what the temperature is and the amount of energy that's being used in your home. When we talk about in this space the idea of carbon intensity, what we're looking at is, and we will be talking about renewables next, so I'm not going to go into that too much right now, but the idea of switching to something that is less carbon intensive. So a good example that people are familiar with is the idea of, from the mobile sources, of switching from gasoline to electric power. And it's the same idea when you talk about within your home. Within Charlottesville in our residential sector, the vast majority of that energy use and the emissions is coming from electricity and natural gas. But we do have homes that use fuel oil, wood, or propane as their heating sources. All three of those are much more carbon intensive. And so switching those over to a different fuel source would reduce what the greenhouse gas emissions are, even if it's using the same amount of energy units to actually heat that home in the winter. Again, I mentioned it before, but this idea of a gradation of switching over to a lower fuel source, or sorry, lower carbon intense fuel source, such as electricity, and then either through on-site renewables or through the grid, that electricity carbon intensity starting to reduce that's a pretty common trend and line of strategy and planning discussions that are happening in the climate action space. So then stepping back from that more small gradation of what types of specific actions, if we as a community are looking at how do we start targeting out of those three main sectors, so the big ones that are the stationary sources are residential and our commercial, and then also considering some reductions out of our transportation sector. What does that mean in terms of either carbon intensity reductions or looking at energy efficiency and reducing that activity data? How much do we need to accomplish in order to actually bring down our emissions to reach our 2030 goal? So the next slide has a lot of information on it. It is three different scenarios in terms of how we could reach our emission reduction needs to meet our 2030 goal. What I have outlined in the orange boxes on the screen are the ones that are specific to the not the renewable aspects for stationary energy. So this is the energy efficiency pieces. To walk you through what these are and what they're showing on there. And this will be online later as well, so you can dive into it at different points as well. Within energy efficiency retrofits. So this line is looking at, out of the three scenarios, what is the % of emission reduction that we model through each of these? This is very high level modeling. There are some big broad assumptions that are in here, but we tried to choose things that were conservative to be able to start getting our arms around really what is that breadth and scope that we would expect might be a minimum level of action, number of buildings that we would need to be touching for these improvements, and potential investment. And so we looked at 10% energy efficiency, or 10% reduction in emissions from energy efficiency, 20% and 0%. Scenario 3 was really our kind of wild card of like, well, what if someone doesn't think any energy efficiency gains are going to happen? What if we don't have any gains out of the transportation sector? Where does that leave us? So with scenario 1, we see 10% emission reductions from efficiency, 20% of our electricity use being generated from on-site renewables. Dominion from this past General Assembly is mandated to have a 30% reduction in carbon and electricity that's provided by the grid by 2030. And then we estimated and said, well, about 5% for transportation. To get this 10% of emissions, we said, well, what if a fifth of all buildings in the city achieved that 10% reduction? That actually equates out to being approximately 2,500 buildings. Over the next 8 to 9 years, that would be aiming to have about 300 projects done every year, and using a modeled cost of what it would take to get that emissions reduction in a small to medium-sized home. So this modeling, I said broad strokes. It assumes every building in the city uses the same amount of electricity and natural gas. That would end up estimating out to be around $1.3 million annually that would have to be investment. If we look at reducing the amount of renewables, but we are increasing the amount of energy efficiency in each building, so a quarter of all buildings, and getting a 20% emission reduction from that energy efficiency, what we end up looking at is having 400 homes a year that we would be aiming to try to have retrofits done with 3.2 million. And then scenario 3, in terms of energy efficiency, because we are assuming there would be no projects. And just to do that wild card of what does that look like in terms of impact of what we would need to do in renewables, which we'll get to in the next section. That one ended up being with a 0. One of the takeaways, and I'll bring this up again later, is in the council action that directed the climate action plan to address funding and financing options. What you're seeing on the screen right now is a large piece of why that was a necessary part and why there is interest from the city in being able to identify what these other sources are. What we're seeing in terms of the need that just these 3 very high level models speak to in terms of needing investment for our stationary sources is significantly more than what current tax revenue and grant sort of tax incentives and grants from local government funding would be able to afford. Additionally, what you're seeing on the screen is looking at just making adjustments in the residential and the commercial sector. So this is not modeling what those gains would be from the city government and schools. These are what things that we would need private property owners to be supporting and participating in our climate action and our emission reductions and our climate action plan in order to get to where we need to go to reach our 2030 goals. Some other pieces to think about in looking at strategies is looking at what our current, upcoming, and potential funding routes might be. Looking at the fact that what is represented in that pie chart is from existing buildings right now. So any new construction, new housing and developments that are added are going to bring more emissions in addition to what we already have in that pie chart. There are considerations of looking at doing proactive retrofits and strategies around going into a home or another building and doing a big retrofit project. Versus what gains do we think we could get by targeting that point of equipment replacement, where there's already an investment cost that needs to be made. And really what we're looking at is how to get that investment decision to look at getting the more efficient appliance or the more efficient HVAC system into the building. In terms of how we design and focus and direct our policy priorities, there's different trade-offs and different strategies that we can look at when we look across our community. Some of those are, we could look at, for example, a small number of big buildings that have more energy use and hence more associated emissions with them. It's a smaller number of property owners or managers that we would have to work with and get that buy-in to participate and to start reducing emissions within the city. Or we can try to aim at getting a large number of smaller buildings. Smaller buildings could potentially, be like individual residential homes rather than bigger office buildings. Another factor that comes into play is something called the split incentive. Charlottesville, in terms of its residential population, is about 60% rentals. So if we're looking at improving rental properties and residences, the emissions and the activities that the renters are using, the occupants of those buildings, is what's associated with the emissions. But the individuals who own the properties, who make those decisions about investment upgrades, those are the property owners. And so even if the emission gains are associated with savings on energy bills, greater comfort and occupancy in that space, the individuals who own those properties are not receiving that direct benefit. And so you have a split there in terms of what the incentive or what the motivation is for making those changes. So as we're looking at strategies for moving forward, we need to be mindful of that. It may be a small number of big buildings that are actually apartment buildings. And so that qualitative benefit of what those improvements are could touch a large number of lives. But the decision makers who have that acting agency could be a smaller number of folks that we're trying to work with and trying to find strategies and funding mechanisms that meet their needs to then rebalance what that split incentive is. Connected into that, for a lot of different upgrade items, is that over the lifetime of the product, it ends up having savings. The challenge, though, for a lot of people is looking at, well, how do they get that upfront cost? How do they pay for it originally so that they can then start getting those energy savings? One of the important things related to this is that if you have those energy savings, you have a way to then make that up, to pay for that upfront investment. It's just that the timelines are not aligned currently because you have to pay upfront for the investment, for the item that's getting installed, that will then save you money over the long haul. Additionally, in looking at what strategies and how we design our implementation aspects are the consideration around resilience and adaptation in response to climate change, and what the other quality of life benefits are for individuals who are occupying these spaces and these buildings. Some examples of that, if you think about the insulation and air sealing example, it's one of the more cost-effective ways to reduce energy and to reduce the emissions that are associated with energy use. Additionally, it is being cost-effective by reducing your monthly energy bill. You're also reducing what your cost burden is, and then what that means in terms of what else that family can spend their money on. It increases from increases indoor comfort in terms of temperature control, and it can also be a resilience strategy. If you think about that, the idea of insulation air sealing is how long your home can maintain a comfortable temperature when the power goes out, whether that's in the winter or in the heat of summer. That equates to how long can you shelter in space comfortably before you have to go and find someplace else to find that heat or find that cool air in order to wait for the grid to resume what is providing. So those are a couple of examples of different things. There are different priorities, there's different values. There are different ways that we can design programs, and there are different ways that when we are seeking to bring other resources into the community, being clear about who we are trying to work with, what barriers we're trying to overcome with that, and also then in terms of our own performance measurement, looking back at have we achieved what we were looking for, or what are those iterative improvements that we can do to what our engagement, our implementation, our program design is to really meet and get closer to meeting what those goals are, not just in terms of our carbon reduction, but in terms of our economic and social aspects of approaching climate action. Some opportunities specifically related to funding that I wanted to start putting out there. Within our ongoing set of funding programs that we have, there are some that are provided by utilities, some that are other public funding, and some that are from the city programs. So we have the assisted home performance aspect. We've got utility funded upgrades from both Charlottesville Gas and from Dominion Power that focus on demand response. There's low income retrofit gap funding provided by the city, which helps to connect residents to these other funding programs to make small improvements that are prerequisites for them to then access that larger pool of retrofit funding. There's a weatherization assistance program, which is applied regionally within a broader geographic area than just Charlottesville, but we are within the weatherization assistance program territory. And then the Commercial Clean Energy Loan Fund. That is for commercial properties that can be for business operations. It can also be for apartment buildings and for low-income housing type of buildings for that. That counts as the commercial. One of the big funding game changers that's on the land, or that's changing the landscape within Virginia, is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. This past General Assembly gave the authorization for Virginia to join and start participating in this annual carbon cap and trade program that will produce annual funding proceeds. Half of that is going to go towards improving the energy efficiency of the low-income residential properties within the Commonwealth. The Department of Housing and Community Development is leading and designing what that program looks like. Tomorrow they have a kickoff session to basically share what they are laying out as their process for determining how those funding guidelines will be developed and what they will include. And this is something that is TBD right now, but that is going to be a source of annual income that will be helping to move the Commonwealth as a whole forward in this space. It's something that we are tracking because, as I've stated a couple of different times, we definitely want to make sure that we can provide funding support and help connect our community with funding support to achieve what our local climate action goals are. Some other potentials that are on the horizon include looking at commercial PACE, which can really help to align both the split incentive, but also that difference between long-term savings and that upfront cost for commercial properties. When I say commercial properties, that does also include apartment type buildings. There are also environmental bonds. There's emerging world of environmental, social, and governance investing. And then there are some local policy things, such as the zoning update that's going to be occurring over this coming year as well within the city. Some questions that we are going to be asking the community, and we're asking you all here right now to consider, is in terms of what are your thoughts about what would make these types of greenhouse gas emission actions, reduction actions actually actionable here? What are the holdups of why these are not happening already? What specific barriers do we need to address? And then how do we make this plan equitable? And how would you define that concept of what does equity in the context of climate action mean? Layering on top of that, as you think about what your own responses are to those, there's a question of like, is that a policy need that's out there? Is it a community engagement and education need? Is it a funding need? Is it something that's a regulation question? Or is it something where we don't have this workforce right now to be able to provide the services that are needed? Or something completely different that isn't on that sample list that hopefully is getting you thinking about what's our strategies and how we need to target and aim those strategies. And so with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Lasheen to do discussion, question, and answer. And we've got about 10 minutes until we are scheduled to move on to the next section.
Hey guys, so we are going to do what we did last time. Just make sure you raise your hand if you want to ask a question, or if you are calling in by phone, just make sure you hit *9. And Martha Smith has another question. So Martha, you should be on. Just make sure you unmute.
Thank you. I actually have a few questions because we covered a few different things. One of the heating aspects in my neighborhood, which is really a great place, is a lot of people like to have a fire in the fireplace or a fire in the fire pit. And I personally think that's as polluting as heating the inside of your house to probably 75 or 80 degrees. And I don't know that for a proven fact, but it's very polluting. And it would seem like that ought to be on the list somewhere. I did hear the mention of, people that are burning oil or wood in their home, for heat, but this other is like feel good stuff. It's, for the resident. It's not, I care about my community or my breathing or my neighbors. So that was one item. It seems to me that a lot of the large buildings, commercial and both retail and all that other, as well as the housing, are owned by fewer people. Like there's maybe a business that owns 4 or 5 of those and another business that owns 2. So it may be an easier sale to get a quick payback by approaching those people. And I was also thinking there's some organizations that could be approached for this kind of thing. The Chamber of Commerce might be a good ally once you get, some of the pieces in place. And also the Board of Realtors, people that talk to a lot of people and have some influence about things, in these buildings might be useful in this campaign. I think a lot of it is going to go to the engagement education thing. And it seems like people are most engaged when they're having fun. So contests, recognition, your name on the side of a bus if you're a business owner that did something wonderful. I mean, though there's an endless supply of these ideas, but it just seems like that's a place we're going to have to go to create some visibility for these issues. And I think that wraps it up for me for now. Thanks.
Great, thank you. So I guess I can provide a couple of responses to those things that you just shared. One of the things in terms of fireplaces is when a residential property is doing a deep energy retrofit, closing up the fireplace does tend to be one of the pieces within that. And a lot of that is because of that lack of air sealing and the insulation of the air temperature that can move through there. I know for myself, when I've had fires in the fireplace at different houses, it's after the fire is out or as it's dying out, where you have to leave the flue open. A lot of cold air can come in, and that air exchange definitely makes all of the different energy use for that property trying to keep up with its warmth. All of that gets thrown out of whack with that. But that's one thing that I hadn't thought about actually focusing on that. But I know for deep energy retrofits, that does come into play of like, what are you doing with the fireplace? In terms of a couple of the other things that you mentioned, I really appreciate your suggestions about reaching out to the Chamber of Commerce, the Board of Realtors. It reminded me that several years back, the former executive director for the Local Energy Alliance program had done a study about when people are make the most investment in their properties. And there's when something breaks and you have to fix it. But there's also when somebody purchases a new property. That tends to be a time when people put money into doing certain upgrades. And so that is another, worth talking with the Board of Realtors, that might be a good avenue for an alliance to then be able to get information out there, but also maybe get some programs that are targeted around when someone is a new purchaser of a property. And then in terms of engagement and making it fun, that is something we've heard a lot. And that is one of the things that our office within the city is fairly small. And so we do try to work with community partners in terms of supporting programs that they can offer locally. And usually that by locally, it also includes crossing over those jurisdictional boundaries. And so two different ones that I did want to do a call out to one of our local community organizations, the Community Climate Collaborative. They run the Home Energy Challenge and also the Better Business Challenge. And I know both of those programs, they try to provide a lot of support and direction, in both in terms of resources, but also tips and advice to help people figure out how to make actions happen. And they do try to make it fun. So do please keep your ear out for any of their celebratory activities or like kind of wrapping up their sessions and getting ready to kick off their next ones, because that might be something that could be appealing to you and also to neighbors and friends of yours.
Thanks.
All right, so next we have Crystal Passmore. Crystal, you should be able to ask your questions. Just make sure you unmute first.
Hi, this is not Crystal. This is her husband, Josh. Can you hear me?
Perfect.
Yep, we can hear you good.
Okay. So my wife and I used to live in a small apartment in an older building, and our power consumption was really low because it was a concrete building and we had neighboring apartments on all sides of us. And then we had a kid and moved to a house. The house isn't so well insulated. It's made of wood, not concrete, and it costs more money and takes more power to heat and cool. And so I'm wondering what role you see in reducing our emissions of allowing people in the city to build more multifamily housing units that are better insulated and easier to heat and cool, compared to how most people live here, which is in relatively old and efficient, big single-family homes. So basically my question is, what do you see as the role of land use policy and zoning in reducing emissions from housing? Thanks.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And there's a couple of different dynamics in terms of land use and the zoning policy with it. One piece that comes into play is just when you're building new construction, what are the building code standards? In Virginia, that is set by the state, and localities do not have the authority to require anything by right that is more than what the state is requiring. For the state of Virginia, when it has adopted its building codes, it bases its adoption off of the international code, and it can make those adoptions with modifications and amendments. Over the past years, many of those have actually affected the energy performance for what our new construction is. And so there are efforts at the state level of looking at what the building code is and what that requires. One of the other things that potentially the city could consider looking at is working into its zoning code certain standards around what our recommended energy performance would be when there are petitions to get zoning exemptions, whether it's a planned use development or special use permit, looking for a zoning change, things like that. There is a little bit more leverage and opportunity in that space that could be explored. Similarly, if you've been following the city's draft development for a draft affordable housing plan, that is looking at putting investment into creating more affordable housing within the city. And so if the city is helping to fund something, whether it's that or any other construction project, in theory, there is some sort of a lever there to also put requirements in around what the expectations are for how that building is built in regards to energy performance and then ultimately the emissions reduction potential. One of the things that you brought up, though, is that we're not just looking at new construction. We have a lot of buildings within Charlottesville that are older. And if we want to get the emissions on those to be reduced, we are looking at retrofit type of strategies. One of the first steps that I think is a great one for residents to take advantage of is a home energy checkup from the Local Energy Alliance program. It is a whole home look, so it's looking at all of the different energy systems and components of the house. They are not coming in looking at one piece of it, like they're not coming in looking at just your windows or just looking at your HVAC system. And then they can help you as a resident prioritize really where you could make the most improvements for your comfort, for your budget, and for reducing your energy and emissions. I think the question though that really comes is after you get that information, how able are you or anyone else to actually act upon that? And that's where, going back to the scenarios that I showed in the first 30 minutes, that I showed a couple minutes ago, really go into that question of what is that level of investment that we need to make available so that our community members can actually make these upgrades within their own properties and reduce their emissions while increasing the comfort and improving the quality of what those properties are. Larger scale, if we start increasing density in terms of like what zoning allows, there may end up being market pressures that start looking at redeveloping those properties. And if that's the case, then definitely what we have in terms of our building code and what even maybe just the education and encouragement of having a recommended building standards around energy could help in that front, but really looking at what are the policy levers that we can then influence if there starts to be more redevelopment than we currently are seeing in the city.
I guess just to put a point on it, energy use is going to be lower in multifamily dwellings than in single-family homes. Better to live in a fourplex or an apartment than a single-family home. But it's illegal in much of the city to build a new triplex or an apartment building. And so our zoning laws are requiring us to put people in less efficient, higher emissions dwellings, right? And so it's great to make big houses more efficient, but a really easy and actually free thing we can do is to allow people to build a duplex or a triplex where they can't now. So specifically about allowing people to build denser housing, does that have a role in the recommendations that you're going to make to us?
Yeah, and I think some of that does go back into what the building standards are. If you're looking at a net zero single family house versus a apartment building that is older or that's even right now just built to building code, they're going to have different emission standards and energy use in them. But like as a broad statement, I do see what you're saying about having a smaller footprint, and also when you have essentially 4 sides of your property that are insulated because of the other properties that are around there, that the neighboring units, it does end up functioning as larger, not really insulation, but kind of functioning the same way as insulation that reduces the energy use. So in terms of advocating for zoning to be increased, that is one of the things that is within the draft affordable housing plan, is wanting to have upzoning occur as a blanket across the city. So I think that is represented in there, and assuming that new housing is built a good energy performance standard, we would see emission reductions come through on that front.
If anyone else would like to ask a question, make sure you raise your hand now. But again, there will be other opportunities to ask questions. Susan, it doesn't look like anyone else raised their hand if you want to continue.
All right, great. So then let me get on to next slide. So we are moving into the third part of what the workshop is focused on today. The next topic is focused on renewable energy. And similar to before, in case anybody has joined us specifically for this topic or is watching the recorded part and has jumped ahead to this, in order to stay in touch of what is happening with our climate action plan development, we do have information on the city's webpage, charlottesville.gov/climate-plan. We'll have the workshop recordings online there, other informational materials, future events. There's also a contact form if you want to reach out that way to share information. And you can sign up through the city's website for news flashes. We will push out a notice through that whenever we announce new events or put more information and resources and materials on the website. All right, so renewable energy. Starting off with kind of a simple question, like what are renewable energy sources? Renewable energy sources are sources of energy that remain perpetually available. And in this context of climate action, when people speak about renewable energy sources, they're talking about carbon-free ones usually. Examples of this would be solar power or wind power. Renewable energy is used as an alternative to carbon-based fuel sources that can be used by stationary emission sources, so like buildings and streetlights, and also mobile emission sources. So once you start getting into like electric engines for different types of vehicles, you can start looking at using renewable energy as an alternative to the carbon-based fuels. Looking at going back to this equation of how do you calculate greenhouse gas emissions and how do you start reducing them, what we are looking at is this middle part in the blue in terms of the carbon intensity. So it's not just switching to the lower carbon fuels, but it's actually replacing fuels with something that is carbon-free. So other examples within electricity, there's solar and wind generation. These can be either on-site systems. So one of the questions in the first half was asking about if you're generating from a solar system that's on your rooftop, is that reducing our emissions or is that counting towards the grid becoming more green? So there's the on-site piece of it. One of the things that we see often in Charlottesville is that the amount of rooftop space that is available for putting on solar, you cannot put a big enough solar system there to actually generate the amount of electricity that is currently being used on an annual basis by that property. And so in that case, a lot of what people start looking at is, well, what are different offsite options? Some of these could be considered purchasing renewable energy credits, also known as RECs. Or there are other things, particularly if you're doing larger purchases, where you start looking at offsite. And I'll talk a little bit more about some offsite options in a couple slides from now. In regards to natural gas, there is an emerging market around renewable natural gas. Renewable natural gas caps greenhouse gas emissions from other sectors, converts them into something that is then compatible to be fed through the gas lines, and then comes into your property the same as fracked natural gas would be. Some of the industry papers about renewable natural gas, while it does have some significant carbon reduction benefits to it, it is a growing market, and the downsides that have been cited for it is that where the location of those generating emission sources are not necessarily aligned with where our population centers are, and so needing to understand better about the pipelines to even transport that. The other piece is that in an analysis that was done by the Rocky Mountain Institute, they looked at the national potential supply of renewable natural gas. And from their calculations, determined that if all of the potential natural gas in the United States would be insufficient to replace the natural gas that is in use just in California. So there is also a supply-demand challenge within renewable natural gas. And it's expected that there will be some pretty steep interest from industry. Dominion Power, as they are looking to clean their grid. Earlier I mentioned that one of the ways that their grid had become cleaner was by switching from coal-powered plants to natural gas-powered electric generation plants. If they can then switch their natural gas fuel source over to renewables, that would be one way that they can achieve carbon reductions. What that means, though, is that if industry is wanting and able to utilize a large amount of that supply, and there's limited supply, you start to get your supply-demand dynamics where it affects costs, but also just limitations in terms of what is available. When you're looking at alternatives to gasoline and diesel, looking at switching over to electric engine vehicles. The two types that are out there that are looked at in this is either a battery electric, so it is grid provided electricity that then charges the battery that is then powers the EV. The other version of that is looking at hydrogen fuel cells, where you actually have the hydrogen fuel cell on the vehicle, and that then powers the electric engine on the vehicle. One of the other pieces I did want to mention, while it's not exactly renewable energy, but is looking at offsets. And there's, I think, a policy question about whether or not offsets and what type of offsets are appropriate and of interest for Charlottesville to look to use to reach its 2030 goals, but also its carbon neutrality goals. Some offsets are generated by wind farms, where that is a renewable energy source. Other offsets are connected to sequestration. So working with carbon farming or rainforest or mangrove planting or seagrass, and being able to get your offset by actually having the carbon that's in the air being sequestered at an equal rate to however many of the offsets that you are then purchasing. Particularly as our different utilities are looking at how they can reduce the carbon intensity of what they are then supplying to their customers. Offsets seem to be one of the things that are on the table to be in consideration. And so beyond just what the utilities are then providing, where that additional cost for the offsets would be passed on to the consumer, there is also the question within Charlottesville of, is that a route that we want to advocate for as part of our climate action plan of how we are looking, encouraging our businesses and our residents to end up reducing their emissions? Additionally, there is always that question of the data and how would we then track and account for the offsets? But that is a kind of a different angle or a different side of that policy question of our offsets and which types of offsets, things that we would want to be encouraging as a strategy within our community. Looking back at the scenario examples, these are the same numbers that I had shown before when we were talking just about stationary sources. The difference in this is the orange boxes are around looking at an estimate of on-site renewable generation of electricity. And so looking in scenario one at reducing the electricity by 20%. Scenario two is looking at it by 15% for the emissions, and scenario three would be at 30%. Scenario three is the one where, to do kind of that wild card scenario, we looked at, well, what if we just assume we aren't going to get any gains out of energy efficiency and we aren't going to get any gains out of the transportation emissions? What does that mean in order to reach our goals for 2030 that we would need to be generating through on-site renewables? And what you see in looking at this is we technically, in terms of emission reductions, we can, by reducing what's in our electricity sector and what that use of grid supplied electricity, we can meet those goals. It means that we would need to be working with a substantial number of properties. If you look down at that second listing here, from a solar map that looked at, modeled what the potential electricity generation is from rooftops in Charlottesville with solar PV systems stacking those from the largest system and then working its way down to the smallest system. And assuming that's the order in which they're installed, which I've really, again, big assumption, like there's some very big high level assumptions that are built into these scenarios. To reach that 20% of our electricity use is generated by our on-site solar systems would mean that we would need to be working with about 1,200 different properties to get those systems installed over the next 8 to 10 years. The number of yearly projects for installation, that would equate to being 150 projects a year and would be a yearly investment of around 22 million, which is a pretty steep amount of money compared to what we were looking at on the cost for those energy efficiency investment levels. Looking at the difference between scenario 1 and scenario 2, between getting 15% of our electricity generated by on-site renewables rather than 20%, what we're seeing is 3 times the amount of projects are needed to be pursued on a yearly basis. When we then look over at scenario 3 versus scenario 2, so instead of 15% of our emissions being reduced through on-site solar, doubling that to the 30%, what you see in terms of number of projects is actually a 10-fold increase. And that's because the more projects and the more rooftops that we're trying to put solar on, the smaller property size footprints that we're looking at. And so to get the same amount of renewable energy gain for our emission reductions means we need to be working with an increasingly larger number of properties to get that investment done. So in addition to this, which I think really this is what this scenario is, I think the really good use of these and talking about them is, again, to go back to that idea of what is the scale and the breadth of investment and improvements that we need to be making locally in order to start getting at reaching our goals. We can't rely just on the grid becoming greener. And there are different ways that we can direct our efforts. We can direct our sub-goals for our climate action plan more towards energy efficiency. They are more cost effective in terms of kilowatt hours and greenhouse gas emissions saved than renewables. But there are different considerations in terms of that, of how much it affects interaction on site with the occupants of what those properties are, how much of a gain that you can get if you're aiming at 10% or 20% on the energy efficiency side versus how much of each individual property's generation, especially as you get to smaller properties, you can get out of that overall solar. And where are we looking at in terms of funding? If you're looking at being able on the solar front, you're actively, for every kilowatt hour you generate on site, is a kilowatt hour you are not purchasing from your utility company. And so with different contracting structures, if you can align that funding that is not being sent to the utility is being sent to pay for the solar, you start to be able to balance a bit of like, it's not additional investment that needs to come in. It's realigning money that was already going to be invested towards energy, but it's pointing it in a different direction. And that comes a lot into looking at what are the funding and financing sort of models and tools that are available to the community? Is there something that enables them to do that? And what does that end up looking like in terms of number of properties and types of properties that have access to pursue these different types of emission reduction strategies? Some other considerations is looking at the on-site installations versus off-site ones, or is it utility provided? We referenced earlier about how utility provided ones, there is a cost factor of what the utility is paying to get those emission reductions is going to be passed along to the ratepayer. And looking at your on-site installations versus off-site, there is something called a virtual power purchase agreement. It's structured somewhat similar to on-site power purchase agreements, but they're usually you have to have a substantial enough threshold of purchase to be able to partake in such an agreement that for a lot of small homeowners, they probably would not pass that threshold. In terms of looking at new construction and housing, there's also the question of, let's say we can build it energy efficiently, but maybe we want to make sure that we're able to add solar energy storage to those properties later. How can we work that into the construction of those properties up front so that it reduces those future costs and makes it easier for property owners to make those future upgrades without having to disrupt the occupant or tear down a bunch of drywall and add a bunch of additional costs to run wiring through or to upgrade the electrical panel. We still have that idea of the split incentive, especially with larger apartments. How do you get something like a rooftop solar to benefit all the different participants? This past General Assembly session did enact some new legislation that could help to address that, but there's still the need to have some pilot projects happen to see really what does that look like? What does it look like in terms of the sort of contracting and legal aspects for it? I referenced the cost of efficiency versus renewables. There's then what are differences in terms of how these different strategies affect resilience, adaptation, and quality of life benefits. What goes into policy priorities around, are we wanting to focus on where the largest generation potential is? Or do we want to be focusing our strategies on achieving the largest impact on the percent of household income? I spoke a little bit about offsets and how they're not all the same. Which ones meet our values and meet the end goals, responding to climate action that we want to be moving our act or taking our actions locally to then moving these larger pieces forward. There's the questions around just natural gas provision. Unlike our electric utility, which is a private-owned company, investor-owned company, Charlottesville Gas is a public utility from the city. And so some of the questions around what are our policies, where our investments and resources, what are the decisions around renewable natural gas, and what are other regional commitments and goals regarding being carbon-free or carbon neutrality beyond what the city decides? How does that impact what happens with the Charlottesville Gas utility? And in addition to everything else, there's looking at what are current, upcoming, and potential funding routes for this. This list of ongoing ones is similar to what there was for the stationary energy, stationary emissions sources. Over on the potential ones, commercial pace could also be used for getting renewables installed. There are things called energy savings performance contracts, which do look at both the energy efficiency and can look at the renewable aspects. The Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative that I spoke about before is definitely going to be eligible for targeting energy efficiency. I have heard that there is interest during the stakeholder engagement process in trying to get that expanded to support renewable energy or energy storage as well. And then there's the environmental social governance investing, environmental bonds, looking at what can we do in our zoning update around different levers of construction, different ways that properties are built to be, to encourage them to be solar ready, or even just have more solar on there. And then there's the contract pieces around a power purchase agreement or a virtual power purchase agreement, and how those costs can help align bringing these resources, these carbon-free resources into the community in a way that makes economic sense in terms of meeting the needs of the different parties for those agreements. The challenge that I see in looking at this list is that when you look at CPACE or what I mentioned that's not actually listed on here, the energy savings performance contracts, power purchase agreements, and virtual power purchase agreements, is for all of those, you need projects of a substantial size and a substantial value, like cost value, to be able to enter into those sort of agreements and make it worthwhile. Which when we then look at our community as a whole, and we look at the number of smaller residences that we have and smaller, even commercial and like retail, restaurant type buildings that we have, I'm not sure how many of these larger systems work as one-offs for these smaller properties that we have as a city. And so when we're looking at what type of strategies we're pursuing and how we're directing resources, we need to also keep in mind which avenues and which of these tools are accessible to across these different types of properties and property ownerships and occupants, and which ones maybe we have a gap that we could then look at what are resources we could develop or resources we could look at trying to bring in to help meet those needs. Similar to before, the same sort of questions to consider in addition around these different strategies is about what makes these actions actionable, what barriers need to be addressed, how do we make this plan, our climate action plan, equitable, and then what type of needs are these that we're pointing at, like where is that gap in terms of where we are now versus what's needed to get these pieces up and moving so we can reach our goals. And with that, we're going to move into discussion and Q&A. So we'll hand it back over to Lasheen to go ahead and get people queued up to ask any questions they have.
Hi, everyone. If you're just now joining us at this time, if you have a question that you would like to ask, you can go ahead and raise your hand. It doesn't look like we have anyone called in by phone. But if you do want to switch over to your phone for any reason, you can always press *9 to raise your hand and ask a question. So you can do that right now, and I will bring you into the webinar. So Martha has a question, so I am going to bring her in. All right, Martha, you should be on.
Yes, thank you. I'm so struck by the fact that these are just small parts of the overall climate crisis. And then you come to looking at these as parts and then the city of which they are part, and it becomes pretty minuscule in terms of making an overall impact. So thoughts that I've had are looking more broadly at who can we team up with to make a bigger, if you will, footprint of what we're doing. And it would seem to me very natural to tie into the county. I know we no longer can subsume, cities can't subsume counties in this state anymore. And, for some reasons that's probably wonderful, but this is one occasion where it would seem that we would all benefit by putting our heads together, city and county, particularly because the county has a lot more space than we do. And some big crazy buildings. The malls, with one exception, are all over there. And those would be great areas to put solar because they're so big. And the other thing, we're talking about paying for things now. And I think we need to also include the thought of cost avoidance. If this becomes a cleaner environment, people's health is better, and our medical costs go down, and loss of life is delayed. All the asthma things, allergies and things are greatly reduced. I would also see less damage with eventually with natural disasters, floods and whatnot, and those costs would be avoided as well. So I don't know how you can do that at this time, because we're not a great country for thinking too far ahead, but it just seems that needs to be tied into what we're trying to do to cost justify some of these things, and to get our arms around what costs we're really avoiding if we don't do these things, and make it a little more carrot and a little less stick. So and then one more thing, the idea that the utilities are going to want to jack up rates when they have been taking us all to the cleaners for so long. We've been overpaying for our rates and they owe us money, and who's seen it? I haven't. It just seems like we need to be a little more aggressive. We, not Charlottesville per se, but the state perhaps, in countering those rate increases with you can't get this one. You have to do something for the good of the state that you've been taking advantage of for decades. So That probably won't go anywhere, but that gets some of my emotion into it. um, I have other thoughts, but I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I think you brought up a lot of good parts in terms of the idea of cost avoidance around the medical, the energy risks, and also just future climate risks that are the longer it takes for us to reduce emissions globally, which Charlottesville's local actions are a piece of that, the more severe the climate effects are going to be down the road. You know, kind of reminds me of that saying of like, you're going to pay for things one way or the other, and looking at, are there ways that we can reduce what those overall risks are, bringing those quality of life benefits that, like you said, the lower medical aspects, and bringing all those in. And I would encourage you to look ahead that when we do start talking about our climate adaptation planning pieces, a lot of those I think are going to be big pieces of those conversations. Additionally, for you and for anyone else who's on the call, we will have follow-up opportunities after right now. So please do send in what the other thoughts are and pieces that you would like to see in our climate action plan.
So the next person that raised their hand is Dave Redding. So Dave, you should be able to unmute and ask your question.
Sure, I think I'm unmuted. You said, I noticed earlier that you said that 60% of the properties in Charlottesville are rentals. And the landlord, of course, does not pay for the utilities. Well, it seems to me like it would be really low-hanging fruit to convince the landlord to assume the utility bill up to a certain level, and then simply monitor the houses, because now it's very simple to have a thermostat or have your water monitored, the flow of the water. All of that is inexpensive and can be done over the internet. So if someone, say, is paying $1,000 for rent and normally has a $200 utility bill per week or per month, the landlord could say, well, I'll charge you the $1,100 rather than, so I'm paying half of your utility bill, and then go in and fix the houses, because I have lived in some of these apartments and they're terrible as far as efficiency goes. The landlord could actually make considerable amounts of money by just making minor improvements on the properties.
That's an interesting idea. I haven't heard someone suggest the idea of having the landlords assume part of the utility bill savings. It sounds a little bit to me like a green leasing structure, which I have only really seen in larger commercial type properties. I haven't seen it for smaller residential rentals, but maybe that is a model that, you know, through some sort of community engagement type things, we could help educate, you know, people about like what those could look like, or the type of terms that could be included in there.
So it doesn't look like anyone else has raised their hand, but if you do have a question, now is the time. Oops, one popped up. So Peter, let's bring you in. Peter, can you hear us?
Yep, can hear you. Thank you for, again, for the opportunity. And this might be something that you're already thinking about doing, but as Susan, as you're giving your presentation, there were some implications that there could be sort of tipping points where there are the return on investment can be high, and then like big time diminishing returns, like when you're talking about, you know, when you go from using big buildings to small buildings. It might be useful for people making policy decisions in the future to have a couple of these sort of pre-made scenarios, rather than just using pure numbers like a 10, 20, 30 mix or whatever. Like having a looking at a scenario that says, okay, so here's what we would get from having solar on the schools and city-owned buildings. Here's what the scenario would look like if you do those, plus you add the over 100,000 square foot, for example, buildings. and have using those as basis for making a decision rather than just like a statistical split. You may be planning that, but just thought I'd share that. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, thank you. So in terms of the slide, let me see if I can click back over to it for the scenarios with the renewable energy. This with these percentages of how much emission reductions we would be getting. When it comes down to this on the number of rooftops we would have to touch, that is actually stacking them with the largest rooftops as being presumed to be the first ones that would be installed. Yeah, I think what I'm hearing from you is rather than just saying X number of rooftops, being able to say what the kind of size or the footprint of that building is, like how many of these, 450 rooftops are over, X size for a building, and then at which point they start getting the gradation down. Am I understanding what your suggestion was there, Peter?
It looks like Peter, let me allow him to talk so he can answer.
Sorry,
Yeah,
sorry about that.
Yes, Susan. So that's exactly kind of what I meant. So, for the outsider saying like, okay, so scenario 2 is like, these are the easy ones, right? Scenario 1, oh, these are all of them, and or scenario 3 is like, these are all of them, including the hard ones or whatever. So yeah, but
Okay.
you did that verbally. It just took me a while to figure out. That's all.
That's just like, yeah, and that might be something we can follow up on more. The data that's behind this, we will actually be releasing as one of the new materials I'll be adding onto the website, that if you all sign up for our newsflashes, you will get a push notification about, put in a little plug there, is actually that solar analysis for rooftop potential within Charlottesville. It's a GIS-based online map, and the data, the tabular data behind it is going to be posted on the city's open data portal. So that might be something we can follow up with to better understand and craft like how we can take that data and beyond just having the online map available, how it can help to format for people to get a better understanding of what's behind these numbers.
Okay, if anyone else has a question, now is the time to raise your hand. If not, we're going to move on with the presentation. And Susan, it doesn't look like anyone has raised their hand, so we can move on. And again, guys, there will be more opportunities as the presentation continues. Take it away, Susan.
Excellent, thank you. So I very much appreciate the engagement and the conversation here and what your all thoughts are. We are now at the last part of our agenda. We are a little bit after 5:30, so if anybody signed in either on the recording or on the live feed, specifically for the transportation, we are now transitioning over to that. Again, this is the fourth time for people who have been on the entire workshop, but we do have information online at charlottesville.gov/climate plan. That is where we will post the recording for the workshop, the informational materials, such as the solar map. We'll do an announcement and a link through there, future events contact form, and then setting up for the climate action news flashes will be how you can receive push notifications so that you can be kept up to date when we put new things online. In terms of the transportation sector within our greenhouse gas profile, transportation emission sources represent the ways that we travel around Charlottesville and the fuel sources that we use to make those journeys and the associated greenhouse gas emissions that they produce. Based on the type of data that we have available to then calculate our community-wide greenhouse gas emissions, the data that we are pulling from is based on the Virginia Department of Transportation data for vehicle types and vehicle miles traveled counts that they do for the city of Charlottesville jurisdiction. They publish these reports on their website, and they do them for jurisdictions across the Commonwealth. Once we have that data, we then combine that with national and industry averages that look at the fuel types for those vehicle types. So for example, if we're looking at a passenger sedan, what the typical split is between, is that a gasoline powered sedan? Is it a diesel powered sedan? And then currently that's what we've been using. The electric and CNG market hasn't really had any data in that, but I am expecting that to change over the next 5 years, at least on the electric vehicle side. And then looking at, for those vehicle types, what the an average is for miles per gallon for what we would expect the fuel usage then to be for those vehicles. Looking back at the basic calculation for how we reduce greenhouse gas emissions and how they are calculated, what we are looking at in this space is the left-hand sides of this equation. One thing that I don't think I really said too much earlier is that when we look at trying to reduce emissions on the right-hand side on that purple piece, however much we can reduce on this left piece in the green and the blue means we have less that we are then trying to pull out of the air in terms of our emissions drawdown. So when we're talking about this, the activity data and the carbon intensity in the context of transportation, what we are looking at with this is really for reducing that induced demand, so reducing the need for the trip that you're going to make. Some of that could be, for example, doing it as a phone call or teleworking rather than having to make the travel across town. Making the trip more direct, so increasing the number of connections with your streets and your trails, so that one of the examples typically comes up with this is when you look at a suburban landform, where as the crow flies, you might be, you know, I don't know, a mile or less away from your destination, but the only way that you can get there is by doing like all four sides of the square to then get to where you needed to go, because you can't make that directness. In terms of looking at reducing just the need for single occupancy vehicle use, that all goes under this idea of how do we just reduce that induced demand that then produces emissions. Increasing the equipment efficiency, this goes into those better fuel economy standards. How do we get higher miles per gallon vehicles out on our streets? Looking at your conservation behaviors, so combining trips together, known as daisy chaining. If you have to go to a shopping center for your food shopping, if there's also a store that you need to do a return or a purchase at, can you make that in one trip rather than splitting those over multiple trips to those destinations? There's also the idea of more passenger trips per gallon. This could be looking within personal vehicles as carpooling. This could also be looking at increasing transit ridership and getting more trips per gallon of fuel that vehicle is using. And I put per gallon in parentheses because, or parentheses in quotes, because if you're starting to look at fuel switching, you might not actually be using gallons of fuel. You might be using kilowatt hours of fuel. And so what is that dynamic then when you're looking at the fuel switching? There is that gasoline or diesel switching to electric engines, whether it's grid and battery supplied electricity or it's a fuel cell that you have on there. It could also be looking at switching what your travel modes are. So are there trips that you can start to switch over to walking and biking? And then even within the, that realm of what about an e-bike or an e-scooter to be able to get around town, to be able to handle the hills or to get maybe a little bit of farther distance than what you normally would be doing in terms of being able to people power yourself to get that distance. One of the other topics that tends to come up when we talk about the transportation emissions and reducing those is reducing idling. So reducing congestion so that we aren't spending as much time making that same travel distance where our engine is running. While this is an example of the type of strategy where logically it makes sense, we do not have the data available to be able to really calculate and assess that in terms of how it comes through in our greenhouse gas profile. And so looking at what our overall climate action plan has, and that we have these commitments to reduce the emissions within that profile by 2030 and by 2050. When we're looking at where we're focusing our efforts and our strategies, there may be things like aiming at reducing idling that make a lot of sense because we know they have bigger climate impacts, but we need to make sure those are in addition to other strategies that are going to be getting our numbers down so that we can reach those targets. And this will happen, like these sort of examples pop up in other sectors. Transportation and idling is one of the ones though that I know comes up often, so I did want to include it at the outset on the slide. In terms of other strategy type considerations, there is the connection between land use, transportation, and natural resources planning. Where, as we're looking at increasing density, where within our city are we doing that? How does density of residential housing co-locate or compare to where those more work locations are or retail and entertainment locations are that residents would be going to? How does this overlay with our transportation network? Unlike, as Manel mentioned earlier, the county has a lot of open spaces. They are still developing their development areas. Within the city, our road network is, for the most part, fairly established. Most of our properties are developed to some degree. And so we don't have that wide open space to kind of create something from brand new. We have to work within what we have or make modifications to what we have. Similarly, as we're looking at climate and the idea of urban heat islands, which is much more of a resilience and adaptation type of conversation, looking at where are we keeping our natural resources within our city? And how does that overlay with other sort of zoning, land use, and transportation plans? Looking at the fact that our temperature zones and the climate zones within kind of north to south in our country are going to be shifting due to climate change. There's also a question around species migration or creating wildlife pathways over major roads, or how to be able to have these connections continue to exist. Similarly with transportation, if we're thinking about trails and being able to be in a shaded trail versus in one that's being baked in the sun, that changes people's willingness and how they perceive using that other mode of transportation based on the comfort of what's being provided in that environment around them, which really goes into that next of how are we looking at land use, transportation, and natural resources planning in conjunction with each other so that they can leverage and maximize the benefits that we're getting as a community with those. Looking in at anytime we're doing new construction and housing, are there opportunities we can do with our street network to increase those connections? Are there changes that we can make in our street design? What about the EV ready standards for new construction? Right now, electric vehicles are at the point where if you can afford to buy a new vehicle, like a brand new vehicle off the lot, there are electric vehicles that are in that price range. What we're seeing predicted in the market over the next 5 to 10 years is that that is going to greatly increase in terms of the type of vehicles that are coming new off the lot, and those are going to be cycling into that resale market. And at that point, particularly when we have a residential population that is 60% rental, there raises questions around, are we setting up any new construction to then be able to add electric vehicle charging for overnight parking for residences? What are those sort of retrofits that are needed on that? Do residents even have parking that is assigned locations where they could then pair charging and know that they have that with confidence? And if not, what does that mean that we need to be looking at providing publicly as publicly accessible locations for charging, whether that's at workplaces or at commercial locations or on street parking areas, so that we can support this transition to electric vehicles across our community, both within new vehicles, but also as they become more and more a part of that resale market for used vehicles. Similar to the other topics that we had, looking at lifetime savings cost versus what the upfront cost is that goes into it. There is something called an e-gallon, so like the electric gallon, that looks at, this is something the U.S. Department of Energy puts out there, and it looks at what the gasoline equivalent cost is in terms of electric power to get a vehicle to move the same distance. I've been tracking it on and off over about the last 8 years. And generally, the e-gallon is about a third of the cost of what the gasoline gallon would be for that. So there are financial benefits over the lifetime in addition to maintenance costs and all of that for electric vehicles, but there's a steep upfront cost right now. And for parts of our community, which do include me, where buying a new car off the lot is not really an option. It's when these get to the resale market, looking at, well, what does that mean in terms of, are those viable options or not for members of our community? Similarly, anytime you're looking at any sort of property investments that are needed to support different transportation aspects, there you have that split incentive that comes up. I already spoke to some of the resilience and adaptation, quality of life benefits that come with some of these aspects of how are we getting around town? What does that mean in terms of congestion? What does that mean in terms of other particulate and emissions that we have, not just the greenhouse gas emissions? What does that mean in terms of having active transportation and active movement as we move around? In terms of policy priorities and kind of what these different levers or trade-offs are, I've spoken to some of these already. It's also looking at like some of this were the density. Where are we putting transit ridership? And are we designing these sort of systems for just our current users? Or are we looking ahead at wanting to have new and future users come in on these pieces with it? And then I would say that one of the other pieces that is, perpetual throughout all of our different parts of our climate action plan is also looking at, well, what are the different funding options of things that are available that are out there? Some of these, for example, we'll be looking at an EV mini grant program that the city has to get to cost share the cost of installing EV chargers that would be accessible to the public, but would be on private commercial type locations. Utility programs are looking at more, again, at time of use utility rate programs. There's the VW Volkswagen settlement funds that the state is putting out. One of the avenues they're doing that is with EV Go statewide fast charging network. And then we have several EV Go chargers available in Charlottesville that are available to the public for a fee for the charging. There's also a grant that the DMME Department of Mines, Mineral Energy is a lead on for developing public EV charging networks. And the city is one of the grant partners. And so those projects we'll be seeing over the next 1 to 2 years within Charlottesville. Other potential commercial case could be looking at some of this. There is something called the Transportation Climate Initiative, which is informally known as the RGGI for Transportation. And just like RGGI is bringing from the Carbon Cap and Trade Program proceeds into the Commonwealth, if the General Assembly authorizes Virginia to start participating in the Transportation Cap and Trade Program, that will start bringing more resources over to help with these investments. And what we've been seeing in terms of investment funding programs is it's not just for the vehicles, but it's for the site build out and for the charging infrastructure that needs to go to support those. Again, several of these things I've already talked about before that are potential things on the horizon as sources of funding that we could look at as a locality to determine, are these well matched with the priorities that we have and the needs we want to bring into to meet within our community. And there's also different regional transportation planning initiatives that we could potentially leverage. Both UVA and Albemarle County have both made climate commitments in terms of greenhouse gas emission reductions and starting to look at these issues of resilience and adaptation. And so I think there are some good partnerships there, especially as we're looking regionally at so many of these aspects where transportation does not stop at your jurisdictional border. It is a mobile source of emissions. And so just because a car or a vehicle is registered in the city does not mean that it is not getting counted in Albemarle County's emissions data and vice versa. And then just the last little pieces about like looking at what else is out there in terms of non-local funding. There's the Volkswagen settlement fund. There's looking at Dominion Energy has an EV school bus pilot that they had previously said after they get through their first round, they're interested in expanding that and making that more of a reliable program that they can roll out across their territory. And then looking at what's going on in terms of federal funding. So So there are some options that are out there and things that we can look at. But before we can really start to align any of these with what we're doing locally and bringing these resources in, we need to know what we're doing locally. What are we aiming at? And which layers within the transportation piece are we trying to move, which strategies and which directions, and what can we build on locally so that we can take advantage of the efforts that are already underway. I think you guys have seen all these questions. It's pretty much the same as what there was before, but just adding into all these contexts of what the different policy levers are and how we're trying to define what is the best options for Charlottesville pursuing its climate action goals. Is how do we make these emission actions actionable? What are those barriers that need to be addressed? Potentially things that are affordable, so to make things more affordable, and things to make it more accessible to people. How do we make our plan overall equitable? And then what are those targets of where we feel like those gaps are, whether it's policy, engagement, funding, regulations, workforce needs, or something else that's not on this list currently. And with that, we'll switch over to our final discussion Q&A.
All right, you guys. So by now you should know the deal. If you have a question or comment that you want to say, make sure you raise your hand and I will bring you into the webinar. Right now we have Susan Cruz, so I'm going to bring you in. Susan, can you hear us?
Yep, I can hear you.
Perfect.
Thank you. So I just wanted to more make a comment on transportation and really thinking about the transit system and Charlottesville's transit system, and really sort of developing a really robust strategy to improve Charlottesville's transit system. You know, especially if we're looking at infusing equity into our climate action plan, EVs are really far away from being accessible to the vast majority of the community, although they are increasingly accessible, and there may be some incentives that happen at the state level to help make it more accessible to sort of middle income folks. But we know that transportation energy burden is real for lower income folks who end up having lower efficiency vehicles, consequently spending a lot more money on gas and repairs, but also lower efficiency vehicles that require more gas or also cause a lot more greenhouse gas emissions. So one of the ways that we can really help to reduce emissions from vehicles is by really improving and supporting transit and trying to get our transit system so that we're doubling ridership over the next few years. And so I would love to see the climate action plan really look at what are the costs that we're currently spending on infrastructure, on parking garages, that could be avoided if we doubled our transit ridership, and what is the social impact of making services and groceries and churches and doctors more accessible by transit. What is the social impact and cost savings for Charlottesville residents to be able to do that through a bus system that is effective and efficient at getting people where they need to go? So a transit system that really focuses on improving access in an equitable way. So not just doubling ridership of people who could drive their EV to town, but making sure we're doubling ridership for the people who need that ridership the most, for whom the financial savings of taking the bus would be more meaningful, and for whom we'd actually be reducing their greenhouse gas emissions by a greater degree because their vehicle is less efficient.
Yeah, thank you for those comments. I think looking at what role the transit system has, and what you're saying, not just having it increase ridership, but really just figuring out how can we measure and inform how do we increase accessibility with it is a big piece of that. And I think one of the opportunities really to look at that is what is the transit when you talk about accessibility? Where is transit trying to get people to go? What are those connections that we can look at other parts of our overall transportation network and see where and how we can leverage those pieces together? You're absolutely right. Like, electric vehicles are not affordable for a vast majority of people at this point in time. And so looking at like what are the other options that are available now for people in the nearer term is a big piece of where we need to go. Thank you.
So the next person we have is Peter Cribbs. Oh, I hope I'm not butchering your last name. All right, Peter, can you hear us?
Yep, and you're fine with my name, all good. So way back when you were showing those the scenario slides, there'll be more chances for a conversation about like sort of the how we get there. But I hope that 5% wasn't your maximum imaginable reduction in, emissions because of transportation. That doesn't seem very ambitious. And in fact, even one of the options was zero reduction. Um, are, are, can we look at more ambitious targets, or I'd at least like to understand the logic behind those sort of seemingly pretty low numbers.
Yes, we can look at those. The scenarios that were put together for the scenario 1, 2, and 3, those were not meant to be scenario proposals per se. It was more trying to get a sense of like the breadth of impact of like number of properties or property owners that would need to be engaged. And so the numbers on the transportation side were really, there's a lot more to be refined and discussed in terms of what the emission reductions could be in that space. And what you're pointing out is, by having low ones, or even that scenario that was a wild card that just said like, well, let's assume we're not going to get any energy efficiency improvements. Let's assume that nobody does anything. We don't reduce our transportation emissions at all. Is it even achievable? What would that take to reduce our emissions in order to reach our 2030 goal? So those really were just trying to pick some very simple numbers to look at what the trade-off balances were in terms of if one piece kind of took a bigger part of that pie, what was that reduced need impact on some of the other levers?
Yeah, so
and in the scenarios,
like,
oh, go ahead.
Yeah, thinking about those other spaces, like thinking about the renewables, I do think I think it's smart to say like, what if we fail on transportation and we really have to carry it on renewables? I think that's good, but we can't let anybody think that like failing on transportation is an option. Like we are gonna have to say like, okay, now what do we do with for transportation if we run out of lithium or something like that, and like suddenly have to make dramatic progress on transportation instead, so that's all.
Yeah, and I think it would actually be worse as the transportation conversations happen more, because there are so many different moving dynamics within that overall conversation, to try to do some different scenarios within that to look at how do those come through in terms of those dynamics playing off of each other, but also so we can get better modeling numbers around the transportation side to look at that potential impact on the overall emissions profile.
All right, so next up we have Martha Smith. Martha, can you hear us?
I can see it and unmute. Thank you. I thoroughly agreed with this idling comment in the cars. Some people keep their air conditioners going while a family member is in the grocery store, and that can last a while. And I saw so much of that this past summer. Another thing that kind of is like idling is the coordination of the lights, the traffic lights. If you keep having to stop at every other one, which happens a few times, not as much as it used to, that's also adding to the idling activity. I'm thinking we may have a hidden gift in this COVID nonsense, that more and more people are finding out that they can work at home. And so some of that, I think, will continue to offer a decrease in travel and emissions, because there's less, there's a lot less travel back in March and April, but it's still not it isn't back up to its old level. So we may have a hidden gift in all that. The business of, oh, I forget the name that you called it now. It's the sequestration. That I'm very concerned about the number of large trees I have seen just out walking my dog that are no longer there because people are cutting them down. Some of them are rotten in part, but not in total, but down they come. Some are close to homes, and I understand that problem. But it just seems like we don't, as a city, I've not heard of anybody talking about tree ordinances. And when I lived in Pennsylvania a number of years ago, we had them. And it just seems like that's something we might want to look into. And planting more trees, like as an obligation for taking one down, you put two in or something. It just seems like we're missing an opportunity to improve our cover, our canopy. So the last point I wanted to say was that a couple of times state limitations or state actions that the state prohibits came up in the conversation. And I'm just wondering if there's any place for lobbying the state. Maybe it's not just the city itself, but it's the city's residents that lobby for some of these prohibitions to be lifted. So that we can make more of our own rules and have the city be what we want it to be, not within the limits of the state's ideas. So thank you for having this. It's been really interesting and very informative, and I'm glad I was able to get on. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Martha. And we are past 6 o'clock, so I don't want to hold people for too long. But on the last part you brought up about limitations from the state, and I think that's a very good point, that it's very easy in looking at trying to figure out what are identifiable strategies that we have that we can do right now, and things that we don't have the authority from the state can kind of become a preset conclusion of like, oh, well, we don't have authority. Well, we can't consider that. And what you're bringing up this past General Assembly session at the beginning of 2020 was actually pretty phenomenal in changing what that landscape is and really seeing what difference having policy change at the state level can do, and what that brings in terms of opportunity. So I appreciate you bringing that up in that question of like, are there avenues towards what can happen at the state? Charlottesville does submit a legislative packet every year, which are policy priorities. And this city council meeting a week ago, Monday night, was when that was discussed and adopted. So that packet is online if you want to see what Charlottesville put forward this year for that. Additionally, there are a lot of different environmental groups that do policy sessions to try to hear from their membership on what are the key pieces of policy that could be pushed for to have changes happen. And so that process does happen. It happens every year at the General Assembly. There are long sessions and short sessions. This year is the short session. And so it is a phenomenal number of bills that are going to be considered in the space of about a month. But I appreciate you bringing up that question of, really what I took away from it is, should we, in our climate action plan, be identifying if we have policy barriers that are from the state? Are those things that Charlottesville or residents and other industry groups, can work on and try to see if those are pieces that can shift?
Susan, it doesn't look like anyone raised their hand if you want to wrap it up.
Excellent, thank you. That was actually my next question, was to see if there were any other questions that were out there. So for everyone who is still with us on this call, thank you so much for joining us today, for listening and partaking and asking all of the really good questions that you guys had, and also, starting to share what you want to see in terms of how the climate action plan gets developed, what type of strategies, but also what are values and priorities that you have in your vision for Charlottesville on this. We will be posting this recording on the website at charlottesville.gov/climateplan. We will also have some follow-up materials to give you the opportunity to drill in a little bit and take some time to think about and provide responses to some of the questions that we've asked, as well as some other questions that we've started alluding to that we might put a little bit more of a nose on in a follow-up questionnaire for this. Those are optional. We have our next webinar, which is a repeat of today, tomorrow morning. And then with the recording posted online, we'll have those same questions available. So if somebody is watching the recording of this, they will have the same opportunity for providing feedback and answering the same questions as what we have with it. The news flashes, I do encourage you to sign up for those. That is where we will be pushing out alerts about when we add new content to the website, whether it's about future events, more informational resources like the solar rooftop potential map that I referenced earlier, or recordings from events like this where you maybe were not able to attend in person. So with that, Lasheen did put into the chat a direct link to the Notify Me piece to then be able to sign up for those news flashes. So thank you so much for being here. I hope you all stay engaged with the process and continue to think about how we can move climate action together as a locality and a broader community. Thank you for your time.
Bye, everyone.